The Beholder just hits. Most of his attacks or effects just hit us, without us rolling any saves or him rolling any attack roll. One of our party members has to fight us for one round because of the Beholder, and he didn't roll any will saves. A finger of death hit me automatically, dealing 70 points of damage, and he didn't roll an attack, nor did I roll Constitution. We were obviously getting destroyed. We've been telling him multiple times that he's reading something wrong, but he's convinced that the Beholder can just hit automatically. We're never gonna let him DM again. I have not the faintest clue what part of the Beholder stat block this guy read that made him think that the Beholder just automatically hit people, but when your party's getting totaled in such an unfair and one-sided way, maybe you should rethink about how you're using the monster and maybe check the stat block one more time. This story is from 2009, and I'm not sure if it counts as a horror story, as in hindsight, it's pretty funny. Around 2009, I was in a boarding school that also provided dorms for the teacher's staff if they choose to live on campus. A surprising amount, including the one to be our DM, lived on campus. If you lived on campus, you got the same pay as if you didn't, but you were invited to eat meals with the students if you wanted to. Turns out, if you're trying to get a job as a teacher, not having to pay for your food and lodgings saves you a lot of money. Downside is, of course, that you have to live with the school regulations and may end up spending a lot of time with students outside of class. That probably put a lot of strain on their mental health and may have contributed to what's to come. One of the teachers decided that he wanted to host a D&D game and ended up holding an open invitation to see if people were interested. Around 30 people showed up, which is way more than I think he was expecting. I had always wanted to play a TTRPG, but had never done so. As such, I was very excited to finally get the opportunity to play. The interest check session goes about as well as can be expected when 30 people all want to play a tabletop game, but have no experience with any of them. There's a lot of arguing, all the while the teacher is looking more and more like he made a huge mistake. Some wants to play D&D, some Star Wars, some wants a custom system. It's a total mess. It could probably have been a horror story all on its own, but I don't remember it very well, and from what I do remember, it would have boiled down to trying to run a game for 30 high school students goes exactly as you expect it would. Maybe 2 weeks later, he revises his plan. The game will be invitation only, based on how you acted during the interest check, and I'm fortunate enough to be chosen. So if you shouted or argued, he didn't want you in his game. Totally reasonable. We meet up, and he helps us through character creation and rules explanation, as I had never played any TTRPG before, but I had always wanted to. A week later, and the people who create characters go to the classroom where we were supposed to meet the teacher for the game. We wait around maybe 15 minutes when another teacher notices that there's a half dozen students sitting in a classroom looking confused. He asks, "What's happening?" One of the others explains, and this teacher goes pale as a sheet. She informs us that our DM, the teacher, who has been living in one of the dorms on campus, fled in the middle of the night. He packed his bags and just drove. Nobody knows where he went, and faculty have been trying to reach him with no success. Despondent, we all leave the room and go about our day. I don't recall how everyone else felt, but I was kind of heartbroken. A couple weeks later, and we find out what happened. Turns out, our DM had driven to Vegas to get married, and was not coming back. The school was in upstate New York. No one I was aware of had even met his wife, or knew he was dating at all. Mind you, we didn't do this on a weekend. I don't recall what day our game was, but I do clearly remember one of the other players in the game saying they had seen him in the cafeteria the previous day. I sometimes wonder, even now, if that first interest check session is what started him on the path of fleeing, or if it was something else. I wonder if he would have posted about this story on the subreddit had it been around that time. There are two parts of this horror story, and yeah, the first one is a bit more understandable to me. From what I've heard, running a high school D&D club or even just participating in one is not easy. A lot of the times, they can go south. D&D needs engagement. It needs people to be invested, and high schoolers can be really bad at investment. So yeah, not to say that high school D&D clubs are doomed to failure. They're not. A lot of people are going to start playing D&D in those clubs, and that is awesome, and they're going to have a great time. But you need to make sure that it's an accepting environment that allows for fun and enjoyable games and not just eternal chaos and all that. As for Mr. Dungeon Master fleeing to Vegas to get married to his true love, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. Nothing really you can do about it. That sucks. I have been playing D&D for years, 10 years to be precise. However, this past Wednesday, tragedy struck. I lost all of my dice. Every single one was collected over years. If I had a convenient place to put my dice, maybe I'd still have them. Well, luckily for you, you can get the Dicology archive from Arcana Vault. Arcana Vault is back as the sponsor of today's video. You guys may know them for their dice, but they do not just make dice, they also make something to hold them. The Dicology archive is a 6-set dice container and tray that allows you to hold and display your most beautiful dice. You can even store your various character sheets and notes inside. It's an all-in-one dice storage solution. Now, I understand that most of you already have plenty of dice as is, but if you need more sets to display in the beautiful Dicology archive, don't worry, Arcana Vault, of course, has you covered. All of their dice sets are beautiful, and even better, they are affordable, with many of them going for under $10. If you're interested, head down into the description down below where you can find my affiliate link where you can pick up the Dicology archive from Arcana Vault. Thank you so much to them for sponsoring today's video. As always, supporting our sponsors does support us. Without further ado, I'm going to turn back into an animated rat so that we can get back to the video. Just a lighthearted one, but as a DM, I could feel the pain from our DM in this one. We were playing Mutant Year Zero, and we were investigating a string of disappearances from our settlement, while also planning on heading to another settlement we've been invited to and compete in a wrestling tournament. In the zone, we encountered a cross between a crow and a T-Rex that charged us. The group's leader, a gang boss, tells her gang to stand down, goes up to the giant bird T-Rex, and starts cuddling it. Turns out, unbeknownst to the rest of the characters, she had the mutation monster control and had saved just enough points to dominate the bird for the rest of the session. The DM goes, okay, and changes a few things in his notes, while the rest of the group pick up their jaws. We keep following the trail of the missing persons and reach a crater with a bunker inhabited by some slave traders. They're in the middle of selling their wares to a gang of heavily armed soldiers who also happen to have an airship. The gang boss doesn't like slavery and orders us to sneak around and attack from the rear while she distracts them. Well, she rolls really well, we roll really well, and the Crowosaurus is really distracting, so we succeed in encircling them. While talking, though, the boss discovers that the soldiers are an advance party of a whole army and is actually a part of the same settlement we've been heading to later. So she tries to sign to the rest of the team not to attack. The DM is also trying to emphasize that seems like a bad idea since the soldiers seem well trained and well armed. I nod and say that my robot buddy unfortunately can't ignore direct order, and I already told him to fire his grenade launcher. The DM pauses and says, "Oh right, I forgot about that." I roll really well, and the soldiers start to panic. Half of them try to make a stand, and the rest run towards the airship. Unfortunately, they are intercepted by a hungry Crowosaurus, who starts gulping them down whole. My robot and the NPC gang members fight the rest of the soldiers and slavers. The airship starts to take off with the rest of the soldiers. This is when the third member of the party makes a heroic run and leaps into the ship. He fights with the leader and gets the upper hand, but oh no, the airship starts to lose height. "Let me go, or I will crash this airship and annihilate all of your friends," the leader exclaims. The player character knocks out the leader, who falls out of the ship and dies, and as the airship comes crashing down, he reminds the DM that he has a background with advanced technology, so he can roll for knowing how to operate the ship. The DM facepalms, the player succeeds, and lands the ship safely. The DM is a bit pale, but impressed, and says that we just annihilated the main villain, and that he's gonna need some time to adjust the adventure accordingly. It's been a month, and he's still not done. Let that be a lesson to you DMs. Either put in the work to remember what your player characters can do before the adventure, or put in 10 times the work after the adventure. My highest compliments go to the DM, who rolled with every punch and let us get away with totally obliterating the script. Hard to disagree on that score. Yeah, the DM totally gets props here. And Jenny D made a great video where she talked about bad guys getting annihilated. And she went over ways that you can make bad guys more powerful so they don't get annihilated. But at the end of the video, she just straight up said, look, sometimes it's best to just let the players do the annihilating. The players here earned this win. They rolled high. They used their abilities in a clever way. dominating a T-Rex, using a bomb to disorient the opponents, using their tech knowledge to land the airship successfully. Good stuff here. A lot of it was down to lucky rolls, obviously. Everything is, but they should be rewarded for both their luck and their good play. At the same time, I totally would have respected if the DM had the BBG use some kind of teleportation failsafe to save himself at the last second. Because, the BBG's operation has still been absolutely annihilated. The players got a major win here. But the fact that the DM allowed the BBG to die shows that they are dedicated to allowing the players to have consequential actions. And you know what? That's great. The DM gave us anti-magic crystals. Originally, he thought that it would be something so hard to use and so damaging to keep around that he assumed the problem would solve itself. He explained lead-lined boxes would prevent the group from getting affected by it and told us where to buy them and how the church lined its walls with cheap lead. Except, there was an issue. I asked if it affected monks and chi point abilities, and he said no immediately. So my first thought was, sweet, I could put this in my sword and beat up magic users that normally would kick my ass. And I was going to put lead around the gems so I could turn off the anti-magic effects. Suddenly, the DM's response went to, that shop is out of lead. Yeah, the church won't let you use their outside lead. Lead is actually one of the rarest things in my game. So I carried it in my hand and simply stayed far away from other players so I can keep it and keep the other players safe from the anti-magic as well. We ended up having this big fight with a warlock later on. He got bloodied and began to make his escape. Except, there was an issue. One speedy monk later, he was in range of the anti-magic crystal and completely subdued from making his portal, with him running straight to his exit and face-planting into a wall. He ended up interrogated, all his cool magic items looted, and him thrown out of the town terrorized by him. The DM then ended the session and said we did an amazing job. Once we returned to the game a week later, we ended up against another magic user, except he could portal away using paintings. We played it off as being friends and got him to take us into a secluded room that was only accessed through paintings. The idea was for us to go in and lock him in place by disabling the portals with the anti-magic crystal. But I could use the portals with the group. I went to use it and the DM smiles and says, well, you didn't specify you put the crystal in your inventory only while you're holding it, so do a roll for me. I rolled. Oh, damn, it wasn't in your inventory. Your character set it down when you got into the new battle and completely forgot it. Can't go back now, the crystal's gone. Yet another mild horror story for the road, this one involving balance. Now, there are multiple solutions to this. My solution is that at the beginning of all my campaigns, I established that if something is crazy powerful, there's nothing I can do about it, I might need to nerf or remove, and that's going to happen. Maybe. It's only happened twice in the 3-4 years that I've been running this game, and it's never really been much trouble. However, I understand that not every DM is going to want to do that. Make sure to think carefully about the items you give to your players. Anti-magic especially can be very potent, since a lot of the most powerful monsters in Dungeons & Dragons rely on some sort of spell casting to make them powerful. Backstory. So I'll give some backstory to help put things into perspective. About 5 years ago, I graduated high school. I have been super into LARPing, and had been for most of my high school career. My parents had always been super supportive of it, my dad even going so far as to send pics of me fighting to friends and family. Well, after high school, I signed on to go on a mission trip to another country with my church that I had went to at the time. Unfortunately, the bus got into a terrible accident on the way to the airport. I was in the hospital for a while, having several broken vertebrae, the sternum and the left hip. Oh, and a myriad of other injuries. This is important because it ties into how much D&D meant, and still does mean, to me. I won't go into the details of how the recovery went, but to sum it up, lots of scars. Long recovery time, back never recovered, and developed a lot of new and long-lasting life issues, and I'm now in pain 24 hours a day and will be for the rest of my life. With all that out of the way, I'm sure it's no surprise that I had to quit LARPing. I also no longer could work at my old job at the grocery store, as lifting, bending over, standing for more than an hour, even sitting in most chairs for an hour, all caused unbearable amounts of pain. What's more, my plans after high school was to go to the military, and that was now squashed. I ended up gaining a huge amount of weight because, well, it hurt to do almost anything. Needless to say, I fell into a pretty deep well of depression, and I won't go into details, but let's just say it got dark. I stopped going to church completely, and I really don't consider myself Christian at the moment. The only thing that brought me out of it was Dungeons and Dragons. My experience with Dungeons and Dragons. I was lucky that after high school, I kept my core group of friends, and they were very supportive. If it hadn't been for them all wanting to try out D&D, this story would have probably been a lot worse. We all fell head over heels for the game, and I've been playing for the last 4 to 5 years. During this time, I fell down the rabbit hole of becoming a dice goblin. I loved dice and spent a lot of money over the years on all kinds of dice sets. My friends knew this, and for Christmas and birthdays, they would usually get me more dice. Some of these friends I've grown apart from, that's just life, and the dice they get me became sentimental because of this. I also would buy other D&D things, like dice cages, wooden dice towers, dice bags, or wooden vaults, books, minis, and so much more. I even had a set of the D&D Anniversary Sapphire dice. Needless to say, that all this D&D stuff added up in value, probably around $2,000 to $3,000 in money spent. Okay, now my family's view on Dungeons and Dragons. I live in an old school Christian household, and so my parents at first weren't too thrilled about me playing D&D, the whole satanic panic and whatnot, or stanic panic. After I explained what we did and how it worked, they decided that they were fine with it, but probably shouldn't talk about it with the grandparents. I would tell them the stories from time to time, my mom particularly enjoying them, and she even started to, on birthdays and holidays, get me dice and other D&D gifts. Alright, getting sick. So around a couple months after COVID hit the US, I suddenly started to get sick. Mainly just stomach pain, nausea, and what usually comes with nausea. This got to a point where almost every day I was sick and traveled with a bucket everywhere. Everything would set my stomach off. Food, touch, needing to go to the bathroom. Hell, lying in bed would make me sick. I ended up developing terrible anxiety with nausea, which, ironically enough, would make things even worse. This went on for 9-ish months. My mother, bless her soul, helped me out whenever she could, sitting with me through anxiety attacks, getting meds, talking to doctors, everything. The horror story. So while I was sick and needing to be with someone who could help me when it got really bad, I ended up usually wherever my mom was. One week, my aunt and uncle, who normally watch my grandmother, went on vacation, and so my mother and myself stayed at their house to give her the 24-hour care she needs. I couldn't help much because I was constantly sick and ended up either in bed or in the bathroom for most of the time. I think I got desperate, and so during a conversation with my parents, I talked about possibly going back to church. My dad was elated at hearing this. He had been trying to get me to pray and read the Bible to stop me from being sick. Well, a few days later, I was stuck in bed. He said that the church pastor was going to come over and talk with me. I thought, okay, kind of weird now the blue, but sure, I guess. And said that I don't care. My mom and I had been kind of distant the last few days and kept asking things like, you know we love you, right? And other stuff like that, but I was too sick to really think anything of it. Well, the time rolls around and I'm in bed and the preacher comes over and starts talking to me while I'm lying in bed. He asks how I'm doing, what it's like being sick, and other general stuff. He suddenly shifts to the work he's done as a preacher and how he's counseled lots of people in bad situations. He started talking about other young guys who were down and depressed or feeling ill or whatever, and my first thought was, is this man gonna start preaching to me about porn or something? I kinda chuckled at the thought internally, but he went a different route. He said that all those guys had something in common, and it was that they played Dungeons and Dragons. He then started talking about how D&D is satanic, and that the reason I'm so sick and depressed is because of demons that I've summoned into myself through D&D. He then asked what I thought about all that, and I'll be honest, I don't remember exactly what I said and the conversation that went down afterwards from, the emotions that followed in that moment. But I do remember saying something like how I respect his opinion and all that. But he had never played D&D himself, nor seen me play or what we do in my groups, so I absolutely do not agree with him, nor will I ever. We talked a bit more, and I was starting to get a bad feeling when he said that he thinks I should talk to my dad. Me being sick in bed and not really having a choice in the matter said, fine, whatever, and he left. Now the conversation that happened next is kinda hazy, but I'll recount it the best I can. My dad comes in and immediately says that all my D&D stuff is gone. Everything. He talked about how he, the preacher, and some other men from the church had gone into my room 6 days prior, just after I had left the house to stay with my mom and grandma, and they went inch by inch through my entire room and collected anything D&D or D&D themed. That meant any posters or books or collectibles that they thought was D&D themed. So years of books all throughout my life, manga, sketchbooks, memorabilia from my childhood, all of that they took. They then divided the loot between them and went to homes of church members in all different locations and threw it all away. My dad had waited to tell me to make sure that the garbage had come twice between when they dumped it and now, so there was no chance I could go and try to find it. He said that he is not sorry and he will never apologize for this. He also said he knew this wouldn't and won't stop me from doing Dungeons and Dragons, but he did it to protect his family. He said don't ever bring stuff like that into the house anymore, and he isn't afraid to do this again, and that the reason I'm sick is my fault and I'm possessed by demons that I summoned through Dungeons and Dragons. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and kind of zoned out. After he left, I got my cousin to take me to my house so I could see for myself. After going into my room and fully understanding what had happened, and I realized that what my dad had said had actually happened, I just kind of broke down. I found out later that no one else in my family knew, which was really just my mom and sister. My dad had even taken a set of dice that I had bought just a month prior and given it to my sister because she had just joined her first D&D campaign. My friends immediately wanted me to move out, but with my condition and having very little income, I couldn't. My mom told me that they had even asked an old friend of mine, who had once upon a time played D&D with me, but has since moved on, we don't speak, what he thought about D&D, and he had told them that basically from his experience, there was nothing to be afraid or worried about with my D&D or my group. And this guy that they talked to is a missionary. The follow-up. Needless to say that my relationship with my dad has never been the same. I decided to pretend that everything is alright so I won't get kicked out while I go through school to get a new job. I have since patched things up with my mom, who hated that this happened and doesn't agree with it, but she believes that a Christian wife has to agree with her husband's decisions even if she doesn't like them. I also have a newfound respect for my sister, who, while they were throwing away things, managed to save my favorite book series that I'd read since the 4th grade, Aragon, if anyone is wondering. I still do D&D and have about 3 new sets of dice that I've been gifted over the last year, but they stay with a friend whose house we do D&D at. Also, the sickness that I had and no one could figure out, I just needed my gallbladder removed. Now I'm fine, besides the bus injuries and the depression. I don't really have much to say on that last matter other than I hope that you figure that out, and that's really the best I can do on that score. Yeah, this really hurts. Satanic panic is very much still a thing in many places. It's not nearly as prominent as it was. It comes and goes, of course, but yeah, it is still a thing for some families, and for those families, I think it's a real damn shame. What the dad did was bad parenting. It was terrible, in fact. He looked at something that clearly made his son happy and decided to completely ruin it, to grab his buddies and just toss out literally thousands of dollars worth of stuff on the word of a preacher who clearly had no idea what he was talking about. Faith should allow people to be free and live a more fulfilling life. What the dad is doing here is clearly not helping that score. Now, of course, if you're religious, that is awesome, but stuff like this is definitely not awesome in any way. It can ruin a lot of people, and it's not great. And that's all I have for today on RPG Horror Stories. If you guys did enjoy it, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our Q and Play series, where I answer your questions in a rambly, unscripted format while playing some video games in the cards. And while you're in the cards, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment Satanic Panic to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.